Hello, everyone, and welcome to the greatest podcast ever, The Fandom Effect, with me, Keila Cash, and Mark Hallberg, as we give you everything you need in terms of pop culture and our fandom of professional wrestling and so much more.
You have entered The Fandom Effect, a podcast filled with anime, video games, comics, MMA, and unlimited ideas. Each week, a new guest will press enter and discuss how they're making their dreams come true. With your host, Mark the Bushido Geek Hallberg. It's time to enter The Fandom Effect. Now, please insert 25 cents to continue. You have one playthrough. Better make it count.
All right, everybody, and welcome back to the latest edition of The Fandom Effect. Glad that you guys are with us. Hopefully, you've been following us all along. If this is your first time listening, very glad to have you guys aboard. As you know, if you've been listening to us so far, the idea here is to always bring on a guest that's going to give you guys a new fandom, a new way of looking at things, and of course, giving you guys just a great overall experience. I'm very excited to introduce this week's guest, Keila Cash, who is the host of Wrestlesoaptopia, a wrestling podcast with new episodes on Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday that cover Raw, SmackDown, NXT, AEW, and of course, everything in between. Wrestling's a very broad spectrum. Keila, I'm glad that you're here with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here to share my fandom with you and fellow listeners out there to get a new perspective on all things professional wrestling. I think it's an interesting fan base to be a part of, very passionate, very polarizing at times, but of course, everything between those ropes tends to bring us together, good or bad.
So my first question, we'll kind of jump right into it, is you brought up a really interesting point. And of course, everyone who is watching wrestling, or perhaps you've watched wrestling in the past, is going to have their own kind of first memory of, this is the reason I started watching. What is that for you? What's kind of the first memory, or perhaps the first era, I guess would be a proper term, that really kind of brought you into the wrestling fold?
Well, I started watching wrestling, I think, in August of 1999, and it was the tail end of the Monday Night Wars between WCW and WWF at the time. And my first experience is watching a random episode of Nitro, August of that year. And for some reason, I was really intrigued by Ernest the Cat Miller dancing, and I couldn't stop watching. And as a 12 or 13-year-old, you don't realize that you're watching the dirt worst end of WCW. And I endured much more suffering watching Thunder during the entire year of 2000. I was spared mostly from Nitro because I didn't have cable back then, but I always got my Raw fix around the year 2000, watching all things Raw, SmackDown, even the highlight shows on Saturday and Sunday with Heat to really get my fix. And I am going to make a confession to you that I don't think I've ever spoken of to anyone until now.
Well, there you go. So as usual, everyone, we break new things here on every episode of The Fandom Effect. I got into wrestling, I guess, late. It was something very early on that wasn't really watched in my household, and that's just due to some different stuff on the family that's not exactly happy for this podcast. But essentially, wrestling wasn't a huge thing in my household. So I discovered it pretty late when I was about 14, 15. So for me, that was kind of the height of the Attitude Era, rated RKO, things like that. So I have a different viewpoint. I came way after the Monday Night Wars. So for you, kind of growing up in the early era, do you want to give everyone like an idea of what the Monday Night Wars was for wrestling? Because I know it did change almost everything, but you're going to have a much better viewpoint of kind of what that did to the industry.
Well, it changed everything. It made Vince McMahon incredibly more competitive than he was before, because he had this territorial mentality of, if it's not WWF now, WWE is no one else. No one else is important. And Eric Bischoff and Ted Turner got together and said, we want to create a juggernaut that can compete head to head with WWF. And they did for 2.5 years. And it was a head-to-head battle of stars and storylines and stuff that worked for WCW at the time in terms of elevating their cruiserweight division, really highlighting Eddie Guerrero and Rey Mysterio and other stars at the time. And WWF was going through that transitional period post Hulk Hogan and Macho Man Randy Savage and the Ultimate Warrior, when you push Bret Hart, a Shawn Michaels, a Mr. Perfect, an Owen Hart, and eventually Stone Cold Steve Austin when he got hot back in 96, 97, eventually when they overtook WCW back towards 98 and 99, you started to see the switch of WWF pushing the envelope to be more adult oriented. And ironically, kids love risque stuff on television and they love watching things they probably shouldn't be watching. And that's the lure of the danger of anything can happen on Monday nights for either Nitro or Monday Night Raw, and eventually SmackDown on Thursdays, Fridays, and whatever night they're on right now. But that was the thread of just adding more eyeballs to the product, to have 10 to 12 million viewers between both shows every single week going back to back. And to imagine that the 80s was actually the peak of the fandom versus what happened in the 90s is quite remarkable as well. And it's also a testament to see how much you've fallen over the past 15 or really 20 years since Austin's heel turn back in '01 that pretty much shifted the business going in the opposite direction. And also that affected the closing of WCW in terms of once that fan base left, they really didn't go anywhere else. Sure, they went to Impact and they might have went to other places like Ring of Honor, but they did not find another home outside of WCW after that time.
I definitely know what you mean on kids love the riskier stuff. Obviously, if those of you who are watching wrestling, or if you're not, Google rated RKO and Google Randy Orton punt legend killer. I know he's doing some stuff now with the punt, but that was like the first thing that really like drew me. And of course, that's a guy punting another guy in the head in theory. So I definitely know where you're coming from on that point. Back to what you were talking about when it came to what the Monday Night Wars was able to do for Vince McMahon. Obviously, people out there, WWE, regardless of whether you're wrestling fans, a pretty household name. Of course, now some people might know AEW. Of course, that's very new. Ring of Honor has been around for a little while. New Japan, of course, has been around for a long time. Do you think part of the problem before maybe AEW and New Japan, Ring of Honor were able to get a lot of these stars is that the Monday Night Wars turned WWE in such a monopoly that it almost took away from, that passion and that creativity you had mentioned that like the early, late Monday Night War Attitude Era was giving you? Do you feel that it was a mistake, the kind of the way it went down? Do you feel like Vince McMahon should have taken over the way he did?
Ultimately, it was a failing of WCW. Creatively, financially, it just was something that they had the hottest product in the history of professional wrestling, and they slipped. They got cocky, they got arrogant, and eventually it kind of all fell apart. And Vince McMahon took advantage of the situation. He did have once in a generational stars like Stone Cold and The Rock to be those top two stars of his promotion to catapult WWE to new heights that we have not seen since, maybe with the exception of John Cena. And they try to do the same thing in recent years with Roman Reigns. But to me, Austin and Rock and Vince McMahon becoming this larger than life character after the Montreal Screwjob back in 1997, that revolutionized what WWF could be at the time, that they could be the risk takers. And they did have a sense of regard for the future. And it's ironic that there is no sense of that regard for the future now, because the stars are older and you do have a lot of younger stars who are very talented, but it's an issue of how do you trust the people that you have to guide you to this next boom period that we thought we would get with the inception of AEW back in 2019. So it's definitely WCW fumbling the ball, Vince taking complete advantage of the situation and being very comfortable and complacent for 20 years, thinking that he was safe and no one could touch him and he can make billion-dollar television deals and not be touched. But he is being touched and he is being affected. And it's interesting to see how AEW is going to try to chink that armor in the months and possibly years to come, since they're not going anywhere for at least the next 4 years.
Yeah, and that's a very good point. AEW was able to secure a longer TV deal with TNT, which of course means that they are going to stick around. A lot of these talents will, get paid. And again, you brought up a lot of very good points for people that are either wrestling fans or thinking about wrestling, or maybe you haven't watched wrestling in a long time. A lot of good information to pick through. And the thing I want to focus on first that you kind of brought up is talking about the, Vince McMahon getting very complacent. I feel like it's a very interesting point for a lot of different reasons. I feel the industry has drastically changed from the stars that were created 20 years ago. 20 years ago, Rock, Stone Cold, being a movie star really wasn't a realistic goal for the vast majority of wrestlers that achieved that high level of popularity. You can fast forward that to today, John Cena, Roman Reigns, Sheamus has been in different movies. And I don't think Vince McMahon expected, and I want to get your opinion on this. Do you think he overlooked the fact that wrestlers could then transition their popularity of wrestling into movie careers? Or do you think he just doesn't understand that's kind of how the world is changing?
I think what a lot of people need to understand, whether you're fans of wrestling or not, that Vince McMahon lives legit in his imagination in a universe that is all wrestling. And anything that penetrates that bubble, oh my gosh, it's invading his own version of reality. So I think when The Rock broke through Hollywood about 20 years ago, he was shook. And I think if you were not watching back then as a fan, The Rock was still under contract to WWE despite going straight to Hollywood back in 01, 02. And by some coinkydink, they let his contract expire in 2005 in a clerical error. And WWE pretended like we had no idea. And The Rock thought that was a slight because I found success outside of the WWE bubble and you're resenting me for it. And you're punishing me by silently releasing me from my contract and not even thinking that I might want to re-sign on a part-time basis. They eventually mended fences. But in Vince's reality, that's the only reality that matters. It's all wrestling. It's all WWE. And he even created his own film division to accentuate that point. I'm going to keep you in-house. I want to make blockbusters by WWE for WWE fans, and I can pitch it to Hollywood. And that generated very mixed results, a hit here and there, but it didn't really penetrate the way that it should have. And now they're partnering with Netflix and doing other projects, that can be done outside of the bubble and to make money that they can make on their own, which is a smart business strategy. But in Vince's imagination, WWE is where you find your success. But a lot of stars are smart enough to know I can pursue outside projects. There is life after WWE. I can come back when there is money to be made on both sides based on my name value. And the best example of that is Batista, who they thought wasn't going to break through with Guardians of the Galaxy back in 2014. And look what happened. He's a big star now in multiple blockbuster films. And then they realized, well, yes, you can find success outside of WWE, and that success can come back home and give you more shine. But regardless, at the end of the day, Vince still lives in a bubble where all things WWE is the only thing that matters. And if you happen to get lucky and break through, good for you. But he still doesn't take it seriously because it's all about what he manufactures as a success story.
Yeah, and you mentioned their movies, and I haven't seen, obviously, all their movies, but I've seen a few of their movies that WWE makes themselves. And ironically, the one that probably did the best in terms of money, the one with talking about the life of Paige, that was executive produced by The Rock. So ironically, one of their more successful movies that kind of went through WWE is someone that was produced by the very first person that broke out and made like a movie career after his wrestling career. It's a very interesting, weird kind of concept when you really think about it. Like you said, he made that as like, oh, well, look, if you guys are interested in movies, we'll make movies. But I mean, in general, it's only a matter of time until Marine 30 comes out before it's like, okay, do you have any other ideas in the hopper, or are we just going to churn out action films over and over and over again? Brought up an earlier point when it came to, Vince not organically getting stars. And I feel maybe some of that has to do with the fact that social media is huge. It's very hard for a wrestler to stay in quote unquote kayfabe and really delve into their character, because in general you'll be able to, unless they scrub themselves of everything, you'll find some sort of tweet, Facebook post, picture. I mean, you can look at Seth Rollins as a good example right now. His current gimmick is this very supposed to be crazy cult, leader, the Monday Night Messiah. But if you go anywhere on social media, it's him with Becky Lynch being a father. And for me, I feel like maybe part of it is that it's harder to get invested in certain characters when it's readily apparent what real life is for them. And I feel like Vince McMahon also, I don't want to get your opinion on this, when it comes to dropping the ball on certain talents and not letting them organically get over. If you remember when Zack Ryder became very hot through his own YouTube channel, like what was that, 2010, 2011, somewhere around there?
Mm-hmm.
You could hear reports that Vince McMahon got annoyed at the fact that Zack Ryder had gotten over on his own and gave him like a quick title, but then buried him in storylines with John Cena, Eva Marie, and Kane. So in your opinion, do you feel that Vince McMahon takes that like somehow personally when a talent gets over on their own? And do you feel like he doesn't know how to capitalize properly when a certain talent's over? The Demon Finn Balor, Zack Ryder, American Alpha when they were at their top, Brazongo when they were at the height of the Fashion Police, to speak of kind of some newer stuff. So I want to get your opinion on, when it comes down to Vince McMahon and stars, where do you think kind of that disconnect comes from?
I think it comes from a place of he wants to control the narrative, that he thinks he knows what people want. And back in the 80s, and especially during the Attitude Era, he was right. But at some point, you have to evolve as a promoter. And the prime example is Zack Ryder, who did Long Island IZ for years on YouTube, and I watched every single week. He had complete autonomy over this project on YouTube, and basically was one of the first viral stars in WWE that was outside of the bubble doing his own thing because he wasn't getting television time, and he made a joke about it. And I just love his creativity of how to get himself over. And Vince definitely senses resentment from time to time, saying, how dare you get over? I'm going to throw you a bone, but then I'm going to completely bury you because you buck the trend of getting over on your own, the audacity of you. But the best example of this is actually Daniel Bryan from 2012 at WrestleMania. He loses to Sheamus in 18 seconds via bro kick, and the fans lead a yes revolt the rest of the night, heading into the night after WrestleMania in Miami. He's not on the show at all to not capitalize on this moment out of pettiness or afraid it's going to hijack the episode, which they probably were going to do anyway, but he leaned in. Eventually, he gave in. And even after Bryan won the championship, the WrestleMania direction in 2014 was going to be Batista and Randy Orton until CM Punk left the company in a huff. And to me, justifiably so, when you're not happy, then you need to leave and get some mental clarity of what you want to do. And lo and behold, Daniel Bryan is in the spot that he should have been in months ago, and he becomes the fairy tale ending story at WrestleMania and one of the better manias at all time at WrestleMania 30. So Vince definitely tries to control the narrative and then takes credit for someone getting over when they were already over to begin with. And the fans sense when a star is over organically, and we will will you and we will push you to the limit as far as we can. But sometimes when you lose and the stop pushes overwhelm those stars, then we as fans do tend to give up. But I will give Vince credit for this. Kofi Kingston got over organically in a gauntlet match, had a great performance in Elimination Chamber last year against Daniel Bryan in the closing moments. And Vince did change course and put Kofi and Bryan in a prime spot at WrestleMania for the WWE Championship. And Kofi Kingston won in a great cultural moment that made me cry. So Vince, at times, is not completely oblivious to what's going on around him. From Becky Lynch's ascension from a couple of years ago to Kofi, he knows when to hit while the iron's hot, but sometimes it completely happens by happenstance. And sometimes that's where some of the best WWE magic happens.
Oh, yeah, I completely agree. And it's funny you bring up that chamber match because for those of you who do watch wrestling, you know that Kofi replaced a injured Mustafa Ali, who I am a huge fan of. I'm a huge Mustafa Ali fan. So I'm also a huge Kofi fan. So I was very happy for Kofi because, as you pointed out, as a cultural moment, I think I saw it recently. There's only been 8 African-American world heavyweight champions in WWE's kind of like main history, like 8 different ones. And like that, I mean, that's insane when you think about the massive amount of stars that WWE has had over the years. And so as much as, of course, as a fan, I was, hurt for Mustafa Ali, Kofi Kingston. If you couldn't think of a better person than Kofi Kingston to get a push and a spot like that after how many years and crazy spots and crazy storylines, and just being able to get over organically as himself. When you think about the gimmick that he came in with, speaking with a Jamaican accent, and you, of course, everyone out there, you can watch lots of videos of him in the New Day, and he makes jokes about that was something that he had to come into. So you mentioned a really good point when it came to previous stars getting over on their own, and then Vince not either hitting the mark or it leading to something else, which very brings up probably what led to the biggest mistake of him doing that was AEW. Cody Rhodes was very unhappy with the Stardust gimmick very publicly. He pitched lots of ideas, lots of different ways he wanted to. I remember he talked about how the last ditch effort for him was he wanted to be Stardust on Raw, but Cody on SmackDown, and get this like weird dual personality thing, and Vince shot it down, so he left. So he leaves, and he's friends with Kenny Omega and the Young Bucks, Hangman Adam Page, and all these guys, and they get together and they form AEW. So, in your opinion, how do you think AEW? They're very new. I think they just had a year of pay-per-view, maybe 6 or 7 months of TV. How do you think AEW is doing as a newer wrestling company, and what do you contribute to AEW's early success?
To me, they're doing great. They have the talent in place to build a future. And that's the goal of wrestling, is to build new fans that can grow into a business sight unseen and gravitate towards people that interest them. And in some cases, you want to get the lapsed fan from WWE that is tired of the childishness, tired of the haphazard booking, and want simplistic but entertaining professional wrestling. And Cody, Young Bucks, Kenny Omega, Tony Khan, the whole crew, Chris Jericho included, who to me was the early on centerpiece of AEW, being their first champion, to give the company that credibility to say, it's okay to come here. If I'm vouching for this company, that means that we're taking things seriously and we're here to build stars. And they're doing that, from Darby Allin to Jungle Boy to MJF to Sammy Guevara. You see stars that are babies, early 20s, that have been wrestling for a very short period of time, but they're going to get better the more television experience they get and working with veterans. I think about one of the first episodes of AEW with Private Party against the Young Bucks, and I thought that was the best Private Party has ever looked to date against the Young Bucks. And that is valuing young talent, because they're not going to be wrestling forever. The Bucks are in their 30s, Cody's 35, Kenny's pushing 36, 37. So you need to focus on who we're going to build this company around in 5 years. Can MJF be that main eventer? Can Darby Allin, can Jungle Boy be those main eventers? And the answer is yes, because the potential is there. And that is what AEW is trying to do. And that's how they got that television deal from Turner so quickly, because of the early success, because they're reaching a younger fan base, which is so important. You have to reach new fans and say, this is cool. And you're not completely embarrassed to be a wrestling fan, which is the opposite of WWE from time to time, with piss throwing angles and vomit and other things that would make you embarrassed to be a fan. And if you dared ask someone to come over to your house, which product would you prefer them to see, WWE or AEW? I might let them watch NXT because it's a little bit more up class and upscale in terms of entertainment value. And I would offer them AEW because at least what you're going to watch is going to make sense, and you're going to see seasoned veterans and stars on the rise that are going to be great someday. If Raw and SmackDown was an option, I don't know, because I don't know what Vince is going to throw at you that particular week. It could be something good, it could be something bad, and it can make you wonder, why in the hell would I introduce you to wrestling in the first place when you're subjected to this nonsense? And that's from a fan that loves it, but I know the risk and reward of watching WWE at times, and I don't feel that same fear when it comes to AEW.
Right, and I'd like to echo that point for my listeners out there. And I don't watch as much AEW as I first started off, just due to not having certain cable things. But I'm going to be getting back into it fairly soon here. And it's kind of, as you said, I watch AEW Dark every time they put out a new episode. I'm watching it either that night or like first thing in the morning. And it's, again, like you said, because even if it's AEW Dark, I feel that if I'm watching that, yeah, there might be a silly angle or two, but for the most part, I know I'm going to get at least good wrestling and be able to watch some like good people in the ring. But if it's Raw or SmackDown, I'm like, yeah, maybe I get to see Jeff Hardy or Randy Orton or people like that. But you know, there's also a high chance that I'm going to see like the same Seth Rollins match 30 times in a row, or I'm going to see, you know, like you said, piss throwing, which is from not even 2 weeks ago that they went with that on the Jeff Hardy segment. And my recommendation, I guess, would be, from my viewpoint, would be NXT. I do feel that Triple H is, in my opinion, doing a very good job of building younger stars, you know, Keith Lee, Johnny Gargano, Tommaso Ciampa, Karrion Kross, or, you know, formerly Killer Kross, and stars like that. And, you know, for you, you kind of touched on it, that you would probably try to recommend AEW or NXT. So for people out there listening, let's focus on WWE as a whole. So we'll kind of lump NXT into Raw or SmackDown just for this question. How do you describe like the biggest differences? Because you did allude to it between like AEW and WWE, in terms of, production, wrestling quality, storylines, what to you separates the two? I know AEW is early on, but what to you kind of separates the two right now?
Creative freedom for AEW and Vince controlling everything in WWE, probably with the exception of NXT, which is more of a Paul Levesque / Triple H project, which is great. The issue is we have a situation of stagnancy on the creative front when it comes to WWE, and they have talent, the deepest roster they have ever assembled, and that is including the Attitude Era. And they have a champion on Raw and Drew McIntyre who is great, who is getting over during the empty arena era, and that is a miracle in of itself. And you have talent that Paul Heyman, when he was the creative director, as of last week, he's no longer in that position due to flailing ratings, due to a pandemic that is beyond his control. You're trying to push a Ricochet, an Apollo Crews, who's now the United States champion, an Angel Garza, a Liv Morgan, a Bianca Belair. You have people in place that could be stars, but will Vince give up on them in 2 to 3 weeks' time and say, well, it's a failure? But how will you know? Especially right now when there's no fans in the building. You can't predict anything at this moment. So it's something to definitely consider when it comes to the creative output of WWE and how they've really hit this lull since the fall of 2018 they haven't fully recovered from. And when it comes to AEW, the autonomy, the freedom to do what you want to do within reason. And Tony Khan is really good at saying, if this doesn't work, Dark Order, let's revamp it. Nightmare Collective, Brandy Rhodes, this isn't working. We have to just scrap this entire thing and move on. The emphasis of having realized characters that we can relate to, that we can say, I see a star. I don't see you being force fed to us. I see you speaking in your own voice. And most importantly, I see you being yourself without restrictions in the ring and on the mic. And if WWE gives an ounce of freedom, besides the people that they can trust, like a Drew McIntyre, maybe Seth Rollins and Becky Lynch, or a Daniel Bryan and AJ Styles, or The New Day, if you give more people freedom to be themselves, to let loose, have fun, and not treat it as a job and treat it as a passion they wanted to do their entire lives, I think that the company as a whole would be so much better than it is right now because they're rich with talent. That's not a dispute, but how do you use that talent accordingly? And you look at it in NXT, you see the utilization of talent used much better, but you see the ratings versus AEW, they're not up to par in terms of this war that's ongoing. And to me, the solution to that problem is the infusion of both Raw and SmackDown and NXT coming together and distributing all that talent, because those are where the fresh matchups are. And that's when you can collaborate with a Triple H and a Vince to merge the best of what they can do and actually make stars that people can get behind if the creative makes sense. And that's never an issue outside the kinks early on with AEW that you have to worry about, because you know they're going to adjust and adapt versus WWE, who's going to pile on and hire 3 different creative directors in a year and still maybe in 6 months' time make another switch if Bruce Pritchard does not work out for Raw and SmackDown at the current moment.
Yeah, and those are, again, some very, very good points and good information for everyone out there. And I think creative freedom, you kind of hit the nail on the head, so to speak. And I think a good recent example of that you can go back to is Matt Hardy. Bring back him and Jeff. Matt publicly says he wants to bring the broken gimmick. They go pretty much tell him initially, oh yeah, you can, we'll let you do it. We'll think about it. We'll make some tweaks, but we'll figure it out. And they completely drop the ball, butcher it, whatever word you can think of for screwing it up royally. That's what they do. Matt Hardy leaves, goes to AEW immediately, and is within day one able to do all the things, whether you like it or not, that WWE was not letting him do. And you also mentioned, as a time of this recording, we are still dealing with like the crazy COVID crisis, which is obviously not going to be going away anytime soon. And you mentioned in the sense of, you can look at the way that they're utilizing talent and how you don't know if something's going to get over or not. And I was listening to a wrestling podcast, Wrestling Inc. with Matt Morgan and Glenn Rubenstein. I don't know if you've ever listened to that, but I very much enjoyed it as a wrestling podcast. And they brought up the fact that in this day and age, what do you have to lose by letting a talent try something and see if it gets over? If it doesn't get over, I mean, okay, if you watch it back on TV later, there's no fans. So now is the time to let talent try different things. And whether that's good or bad, and we had talked about it kind of off the air, and it's a big topic to talk about in wrestling when it comes to testing and wrestling in the COVID crisis. And both companies have done various things to, in terms of AEW and WWE. I know Ring of Honor is not yet touring. New Japan just started back up, I believe, a week or two ago with the G1 Junior Cup, I believe it was, that started again recently. So you can kind of take each company, or if you want to just focus on WWE and AEW, that's fine. How do you think that they're doing during this pandemic? And if you were in charge of your own wrestling company, how would you handle this COVID crisis, in your own opinion?
So I would never forget, I think it was the second week of March, and it was NXT live from the WWE PC because Full Sail had this reunion alumni week. And during that time, the NBA suspended their season due to COVID-19. There was an outbreak with one of the stars from the Utah Jazz. And we knew then this was going to immediately impact the wrestling world because AEW just ran a show a couple of hours ago as well. And what was WWE going to do? They eventually canceled their show in Detroit, moved to the PC, and since then, that's home base. AEW moved everything to Jacksonville, did some shows in Atlanta when they moved out of Florida due to them being non-essential from being in the hotel rooms and taking up space. So they had to go somewhere else as well. And they never took a solitary break during this entire pandemic. And that was a little concerning to me because the pandemic was so fresh and the death totals were going up and the infections were going up. And you have to think about the welfare of your performers. Like, is this smart to do when New Japan, Ring of Honor, and MLW, they're not running shows right now. They're sacrificing gates and pay-per-views by saying, let's stay at home and let's think about our talent and not fire anybody, unlike WWE, who decided to lay off a whole bunch of people post WrestleMania to save money that they did not need to save because they're making a whole lot of money through their television deals this year and for the next 4 years. For both companies, considering that they had to work with split crews at one point, people staying at home by choice and not able to fly in due to quarantining in certain states, for the most part, they've done a respectable job. AEW brought the atmosphere with the fans in the audience, courtesy of the wrestlers, which was a nice touch. It took WWE 2 months to finally have some ambiance in the PC and Full Sail University to add some life to the shows. But it also revealed who can really adapt during this era, despite how uncomfortable it might be at times to watch these shows. I think about an Asuka, I think about a Chris Jericho, a Drew McIntyre, a Charlotte Flair, a Kevin Owens, a Seth Rollins. There's so many people that have elevated their games during this pandemic to know that you can adapt to any situation, that you don't have to have a full house to be engaging and compelling. And I do give both companies credit for that. Now, as for the COVID testing, I give AEW credit. Every show they do, everyone is tested beforehand before you even in the building, from the camera person to the performers, from the referees to people sitting in the audience. I appreciate that. Up until this week, WWE was doing none of that despite one positive test. Then a second positive test comes through and they shut down production on Tuesday of this past week. And they finally, for the first time ever, test everyone. And that is something they should have been doing a long time ago to ensure the safety of your performers. And that is the one thing that's irked me through this process, that I want the performers to take care of themselves and for the company to take care of their talent and not think about the dollar. And I think that is one of the few things that has been disappointing when it comes to WWE being stubborn. And as I mentioned earlier, Vince living in his own universe. When it comes to this pandemic does not affect my circle, this isn't real to me, and therefore I don't have to relate to this reality, which is ever so will. And I just hope that after this outbreak within the PC is controlled, that they will do regular testing to make sure everyone is safe, which is the right thing to do.
Yeah, exactly. And rapid tests and stuff aside, obviously, if you're going to move forward with doing, quote unquote, live shows or whatever variation you're doing, safety has to be the most primary concern. And as much as wrestling fans as you and I are, and for people out there listening, and for people who are perhaps thinking about watching wrestling again, we would rather not watch wrestling than have someone get sick, or obviously perhaps even worse. But on a happier note, that's not related to getting sick. You guys that are familiar with the Fandom Effect, I always like to touch on some key points with each guest when it comes to particular fandoms or just things in general. So for Keila, I want to kind of ask you a few kind of questions here. And the first one I kind of want to touch on is, for you, what does that mean to you being a wrestling fan?
Being a wrestling fan means that you are incredibly passionate about what you're watching as a fan, that there's something about the men and women of this industry that grab your attention, from what they can do on the mic to what they can do in the ring, and the stories they tell and how they affect us, and how we get excited because there's a sense of the unknown every time we watch a Raw, a SmackDown, an AEW, or an NXT, or a TakeOver. That thrill of someone finally overcoming the odds and winning the big one, and you can shed tears of joy, or being incredibly frustrated at stupid things happening and you have to say something about it. And it makes you want to do a podcast 3 times a week, plus pay-per-views and quarterly reviews to express those thoughts, because it's such a passionate fan base that loves and sometimes hates everything that they see. But it comes generally from a good place if you know where to look, if you know where to find that positivity and embrace the criticism when it's warranted, and to know that despite everything that can go on in terms of the corporate structure of a company, the performers, mostly at the end of the day, they bust their asses for us, for our entertainment, especially during a pandemic that none of us could have foreseen 6 months ago. And they give it their all. They hurt themselves for us. They risk their lives for us. And that is something that I don't think any other professional industry does on a regular basis. We have professional sports that give us that thrill and that chase and a story sometimes, but in wrestling, it's something different. It's a little bit more raw and gritty and sometimes underground despite the national exposure. And it's still a dirty little secret in some circles because, it's not real, but it's real to us because those feelings and those actions are real. And those reactions we get from watching together is real. And watching the feedback on social media or on YouTube and see the genuine elation or sometimes outright anger of certain things, it comes from a real place. But you have to find out how those emotions affect us from a genuine sense, not from being petty and not from being cruel for the sake of being cruel. Find the outlet that makes you feel good about being a fan. Find those who can lift you up and be around those that are proud to embrace the craziness of this industry, flaws and all.
Yeah, again, amazing. And you, to share a quick story with everyone out there on, obviously, is some stuff fake? Sure. Do they do things with tables and chairs so you're not directly hitting someone on the head? Okay, yes. But a lot of the stuff, I think, like you said, people just assume, well, it's all fake. Well, some of it is, some of it's not. I have a really good friend of mine who used to be an indie wrestler in Michigan, where I was living, wrestling for a indie wrestling company in Michigan called XICW. If you live in Michigan, they're a very good indie company. Go ahead and please support them, especially with today, them not being able to put on shows. They do amazing work. But I remember I'd go to shows with him, and I remember in particular, I brought him to a show. He was in a battle royal, and he told me, it's not going to take long. I'm getting thrown out first. So then I'll go to the back, I'll come back out, and we'll hang out for a little bit, we'll watch the show, and then we'll leave. And when he got thrown over the top rope, he clipped the ring post on his way out when he got thrown and got a concussion. And we didn't realize this until much later, but it just goes to show you, I mean, these are, indie wrestling, guys, they're lucky on some shows if they'll make $50, at most. And the things that they kind of will put themselves through to entertain us, the fans. So again, WWE, of course, you guys can, give your support and stuff like that. But if you are liking wrestling, or if you're curious about it, indie shows is a pretty interesting way to start. And I'm guarantee you, most people listening, you will have some sort of local company near you. And Keila, I'm sure everyone listening can obviously tell how passionate you are about wrestling, which of course leads to the question of, have you ever thought about being a wrestler yourself with how much passion you clearly have for this industry?
I can safely say absolutely not. I respect everyone that's in the industry, but I've never had this desire to be a professional wrestler. But I've always been a fan of getting more information from reliable sources and knowing about the business, the business metrics, the financials of it, and how things work in terms of the creative process. That's what draws me in, and to know the people that are so passionate about the industry and to know what they can give back to it. And to find that community has been super important to me, but I've had zero desire to actually be a wrestler. But I respect everyone's right. Like a Sasha Banks, who was enthralled with Eddie Guerrero when she was a little girl, to say that's what she wanted to be when she grows up. That's beautiful. And I always find it funny when we see these stars now meeting the Hardy Boys and Edge and Christian, and they were kids. And it says, damn, everyone got old very quickly during this era. Like, whoa, like, okay, I'm old and the wrestlers are old. And it's crazy to look back at that fandom because you never know. The person you take a picture with could be the next Sasha Banks or Bailey 10 or 15 years down the road. And it's cool to see that maturation and that love develop from a fan to a wrestler. But I can safely say that will never be me. And
See, you brought up an interesting point when you're talking about you never know when you take a picture with someone. I have no affiliation with this wrestler whatsoever. I've only met him a few times. There's a wrestler who was just signed to TNA. He's in a tag team right now called the Deaners on the Indies. He's known as Jake something, and he's currently kind of blowing up. Like Impact just signed him. He talks about how Bobby Lashley was the person who pushed for Impact to sign him, but I met him at indie shows at XICW when I would help out with my friend who was an indie wrestler. And again, like, you never know, like now this guy's wrestling for Impact, and who knows where he could go from there. And it's just, again, to your point, you never know when you go to some things, like who the person you're meeting could be. I'm with you on that. I have never tried. I almost did. Keila, are you familiar with it's a couple years ago, but who Truth Martini is with Ring of Honor?
yes.
Okay, so he has a wrestling school in Michigan. That's where my friend trained out of. And I've met him. So I went to the school and he was pitching me to join his wrestling school. And I almost did. At the time, I was deciding between heading into MMA or possibly choosing wrestling. And the only reason I didn't go into wrestling was that the school needed like a few thousand up front, and MMA was a per month thing. And I did not have thousands of dollars to my name. So I had a very brief moment where things had gone differently. I could have trained under Truth Martini in Ring of Honor. But again, nicest guy in the world. His wrestling school in Michigan. Those of you who are listening, if you're from Michigan, when stuff opens back up, please check out Truth Martini's wrestling school. They do some really amazing work there and produce some definitely some really amazing talent. And so for Keila, I mentioned this to you off the air, and one of the bigger questions I try to get to when it comes to my guests is, and this can be not just wrestling, you can kind of talk about yourself in general, but whenever you think of origin stories in video games or comics, it's always, what led you to be where you are now, in podcasting. And so for you, we had talked about the earlier memories of you watching wrestling going up, but for you, whether it's wrestling or other things, what's your origin story for the listeners out there? What brought you to where you are today? And could you offer somewhat advice on things that you've learned in kind of your life getting to today?
Well, my origin stories basically go with kind of the name of the podcast. Wrestlesoaptopia is a tribute to wrestling and soap operas that I love, thanks to my grandma, that we watched every day together for years. When I was like 5 years old, that was the first bit of storytelling I got episodically before wrestling became the predominant fixture in terms of what I love. And I love many things, but wrestling is that one constant for me that I can always go to when you need that escape, you need some excitement to get away from a lot of the sadness in the world, especially this year, the year of 2020, that absolutely sucks. But that's where the origin begins for me, to know that you have a genuine passion for something and to know it can develop and evolve over time, that gave birth to this podcast. I was a podcast co-host for 4 years, and it was cool to be able to talk to someone that shared similar interests as mine. But ultimately, I think a couple of years ago, I decided that I wanted to have a platform that was completely mine, that I didn't have to worry about being on a network and worried about being kicked off because someone wasn't passionate like I was. And that wasn't attributed to my co-host because we both loved it, but life got busy and I decided to pursue this on my own. And it was a year-long journey to find the perfect podcast platform Shout out Buzzsprout for being awesome.
That's true. Go
I
Buzzsprout.
mean, they're awesome. They're tremendous. And to find an affordable platform that you can express yourself freely and to connect with people from all over the world to, hey, someone's relatable to you. Someone gets it. They're not going to talk down to you. They're going to elevate the conversation and let you escape for half an hour or an hour of me talking to you, and I'm not completely sucking. And it's refreshing to be able to have that space to do that. And I attribute that fandom for soaps and for wrestling, which is basically to me one and the same. Both fan bases are incredibly passionate about their shows. They love the creative process when it works, and they hate it, and they call for mass firings. They call for people to be replaced, and then when they get what they want, if it doesn't change, they want for more firings and they want more changes. It's the never ending cycle of hell as a soap fan and a wrestling fan rolled into one. And those are two things I can definitely relate to. And I love them both still. I'm still hanging on to one soap in particular, General Hospital, to this day. I love it and I hate it sometimes, but I will never let it go because it's the one show that will always bring you back to, I know this person. And even though new faces come and go, it's the consistency of a story that I can relate to, the characters I can gel with, and I can say the same for professional wrestling. And I love interacting with both fandoms, even though they're crazy as hell at times and it gets real brutal. But I love the appreciation of the art form of both, to know that they're telling similar stories and they would drive you absolutely crazy and they'll bring you incredible joy at the same time when they get it right. And they're both underappreciated. They're both very underground despite being on international television at times because it's a stigma. Oh, it's not real acting. That's not real acting. That's not real action. That's all fake. It's fake, but to us, it tells stories that we can relate to, good and bad. And as fans, we have the right to say what works and doesn't work within reason without bashing the actors or the wrestlers or the writers. Yes, some things suck, but I would never come for people personally on social media. That's not my style. For those that choose to do so, have at it. And here's a little hint. They mute your disses. They don't see you. They don't hear you. So stop.
Yeah, and it's a great point. A lot of stuff has, we won't get into specific details, but a lot of things have happened with certain wrestlers in New Japan and various other promotions that, for the vast majority of these wrestlers, the bigger name people are not going to respond to criticism, but there are a lot of the ones who are very passionate about their fan base. So there's no need to attack people selfishly just because you don't like an angle or, yes, it's good that you feel so passionate. And like you said, a big thing, like I haven't watched soap operas myself, but I obviously watch wrestling. So I know what you're talking about in terms of like you get invested in these characters and you get invested in storylines. And so you become very passionate, but the key is to channel that passion into productive things. You can, of course, make your voice heard and your message get across without needlessly like attacking people. And like you said, for the vast majority, that you get blocked and they never read it and they don't care. So you're just, yelling at someone for the sake of yelling at someone, which, I feel like there's other things that would probably need to be addressed. But the reason why I asked that question, you did an amazing job of kind of explaining your origin story and kind of talking about wrestling and soap operas and things to be passionate about, which is great advice for everyone out there that perhaps is, maybe been away from wrestling for a long time and is looking for a reason to kind of get back in. And we had mentioned it previously in the episode, but if you're going to kind of look at it, probably, I think you had said like AEW. I mean, if you had to pick one, is AEW kind of your go-to, or would you say that NXT is a starting point? I know you had mentioned both, but in your opinion, what's like, if you had to pick one to tell the listeners out there, like if you're going to start watching wrestling or get back into it, start here?
Very tough choice. And I love both. I think they're both the best wrestling promotions on Wednesdays in a wrestling period that are consistent. I know NXT is kind of herky-jerky these days, and there's rumors about Vince, dipping in, but so far we have no inclination of that. Please God, no. But in all seriousness, if I were to suggest a promotion to check out, I would say if you're watching a show for the first time, completely blind, I would say AEW for this reason. You're going to get variety. You're going to get young talent. you're going to get veterans, but the most important thing is you're going to get common sense professional wrestling. You're going to get a lot of razzle dazzle, a lot of flash, a lot of excitement that's going to hook you from the opening bell. There might be things that might not be your taste or your style, and that's completely understandable. You're not supposed to like everything, but I do think watching AEW for the very first time will give you a different perspective on wrestling, that it can be fun in a loose way in terms of freedom and creative autonomy. And you can finally find a product to say, okay, your intelligence is not being insulted. It's a great escape. And you're seeing the future spotlighted. And I would also suggest watching NXT as well. It's very bare bones. It's very old school traditional wrestling. Great talent there. But as far as that excitement, that freshness of being a fan, I would suggest AEW as the first bet. I would have said 10 years ago Raw, but that's a 5-hour chore in 3 hours that feels like 10.
Yeah, it really does. Three hours is vastly too much for any wrestling show. And I can say, in my opinion, NXT used to be my humongous go-to, and it still is my favorite just because I'm a huge fan of the organically grown talents. You know, I'd mentioned it before, Keith Lee, Johnny Gargano, Damian Priest, people like that. But even when NXT went to 2 hours, I don't find myself enjoying it as much as I did when it was 1 hour. You know, when it was 1 hour, it was such a short time to try to pack in what you could, that I would get so into these certain storylines or a potential match being teased where I would actually say like, oh man, I got to wait till next week to watch this. But now I'm like, oh, it's 2 hours. Like there's a high chance that it'll just get put at the end of the show and I'll get to see it anyway. There's less incentive. Like the longer the show is, I feel like it's less incentive to watch it immediately because you're like, it's 3 hours. There's a very high chance I'll just be able to watch it later, or they'll show enough highlights of the match where I'm going to feel like I watched it anyway. That kind of leads me to the last big topic I want to briefly touch on is the women's revolution that kind of started with WWE a couple years ago and leading to in NXT and stuff, like some of the most stacked women's roster. And so you've watched wrestling from the beginning when it was less about talent and more about how do you look like in a bikini. And so for you, what's it been like kind of witnessing at least enough of a change to where, you know, like your Sasha Banks or your Liv Morgan, where yes, of course they do focus on things maybe they probably shouldn't, but what's it like to at least see that some talents like Asuka, stuff like that, are getting over on talent after all this time?
It's great to see, and we still have a very long way to go. For me, when I was watching WWF, now WWE in the early 2000s, all we had was the bikini contests, the lingerie matches, the paddle on a pole matches. But then eventually Fit Finlay takes control of the women's division as a rib, saying, hey, you can't turn these women into wrestlers. There'll never be anybody. But he turned Trish and Lita and Victoria and Molly Holly and so many others into these legit performers that could get the right kind of heat from the fans. And it's all about their body parts and their puppy, so to speak. They got over on their ability in the ring. And I will always vouch for that era, despite WWE trying to whitewash it and say, well, this is the revolution. Now, no, before 2016, there was a women's championship in the 2000s that Trish and Mickie James and Lita and Victoria and Gail Kim and Molly Holly have held, along with Ivory and Jacqueline, and the list goes on and on and on. So don't completely dismiss what these women did during the early 2000s. And I can throw in Michelle McCool and Layla as well before they transitioned into the Divas title that was... And I know for a lot of the girls that were working behind the scenes that they really took this division seriously, but the company didn't by giving them 2 minutes. That was always considered the bathroom break match, and the people didn't take it seriously at the time. It was no fault of their own. They did what they could do with the time they were given. And I shout out the Bella Twins and Natalya and Beth Phoenix and Caitlyn and Eve Torres for trying their best. And AJ Lee kind of helped bridge that gap in the early 20-teens to make sure, hey, let us break through with the personality. And for me, she was the first one to say, okay, we can do this. And Paige came along, and then Charlotte and Becky and Sasha and Bayley down at NXT, and all that growth from Triple H saying, let's take this division of women seriously. Let's give them agency and autonomy, and let's not take them for granted, give them the platform. And they did just that. And since then, it's been smooth sailing. My only critique when it comes to the division for WWE, and in some cases AEW as well, is the matter of being able to tell compelling stories that don't involve a major championship, to give the women depth and character work that we can relate to, that they're not all stereotyped as being bitchy and catty and they're all after one thing. Let's give dimensions and range to the women's division. And I was single out Sonya Deville and a Becky Lynch over the past couple of years who've given us that variety of being different and standing out and given a platform to be themselves, that people can relate to them and say, I believe what she's saying, I believe what she has to offer. And that brings more opportunities for the women who can compete for championships eventually, but also be valued in these small storylines within the WWE ecosystem as well. And I think AEW will eventually get there as well. They have a division that's hurting right now due to some injuries, but they do have pieces there that just need a little bit more fleshing out to say, hey, this character has purpose and they're just not here to fill up time. And if you do that, then everyone will grow, everyone will thrive. And this women's revolution, the WWE loves the tagline so much, can really reach its full potential.
Yeah, some great points, and apologies, I did not mean to forget AJ Lee and them. They, of course, obviously did massive. I mean, you can't, like you said, you touched on it probably way better than I ever could of contributions that they've made. So for those of you that are listening, if you're curious about old matches, I'm pretty sure YouTube has like old Beth Phoenix and matches like that. I'm sure you could find older matches to watch and would highly encourage you to do so, because as Keila pointed out, that's really where everything started. Yes, WWE is going to, I guess you can, in terms of marketing it, I guess is 2016, but stuff started way before then. You've mentioned, the Divas Championship was its own thing, but you still had, like you said, a lot of talent during that era. AJ Lee, Michelle McCool, who touches, The Undertaker has a special going on right now on the WWE Network, and Michelle McCool, they touch on various things that she's done, and it's a very good special. If you have the WWE Network, it's a very good special about The Undertaker. So kind of before we kind of quickly wrap up here, Keila, I have one last question for you. I want to kind of get your thoughts on who we'll take it both with. If you have someone in Ring of Honor or New Japan, we throw them in there as well. But to you, we'll kind of go through each company. So we'll start with AEW, and then we'll go down the list. So you can pick male or female. You can pick one or you can pick both. Who is your current favorite wrestler on each promotion?
Very tough choice for AEW, but I'm going to pick Kenny Omega for the men and Hakura Shida for the women for AEW.
Okay, I can respect that. Kenny does some pretty crazy work, and Hakura Shida is definitely growing on me. So I highly encourage you guys to check those out. So let's go with WWE now.
WWE, Drew McIntyre and Asuka. Very simple answers because they're the best. And Drew, I'm finally glad, is getting his shot as WWE champion. I wished there were actual people there to appreciate it, but I think once we get people back in the building some point in the near future, they will appreciate him. And Asuka has performed miracles during this empty arena era and has proven why she is one of the best to ever do it in any promotion. I adore her. I'm glad she's a champion, and they're carrying Monday Night Raw, and I cannot begrudge them. I have to thank them every single week for brightening up my nights when it's so long.
Oh yeah, I'm 100% with you on nights being long, and 100% with you on Asuka as well. Huge Asuka fan. Her YouTube channel is hilarious, by the way. If those of you if you're Asuka fans, Kana-chan TV is her YouTube channel. It's hilarious. Does some awesome stuff. But very happy. I like her undefeated streak. Like I was so upset when she lost to Charlotte, and I'm really hoping that at the next pay-per-view, whenever she faces Charlotte in a one-on-one, that she finally gets that win and they don't just put the belt on Charlotte again. Not knocking Charlotte. She's obviously a generational talent, but like you said, you're not going to get new organic stars if you don't build up different people than just putting the belt on someone previously. I don't know if I know we mentioned Ring of Honor New Japan. Do you have anyone in either of those promotions that you're fans of?
I would say for Ring of Honor, until things pick up once again, I will go with Bandino and also Flip Gordon, who's severely underrated, who decided to stay with Ring of Honor on a new long-term contract, which I'm very happy about. He definitely has a lot of potential with Marty Scurll in charge of creative and trying to get Ring of Honor back to where it was pre AEW, which is a hard task, but especially during a pandemic, they're going to try their best. And as for New Japan, I'm going to cheat a little bit because I'm going to select Kazuchika Okada, Hiroshi Tanahashi, and Hiroshi Tanahashi's hair.
And for those listening, what about the hair?
It's beautiful. It's luxuriously long and shiny. Even when he chops it, it still looks beautiful. I don't know who his stylist is, but it's Pantene Pro V Spectacular, and AJ Styles would be jealous of that hair. I mean, it's something to really admire. It's a showstopper.
I'm not super familiar with him, so I'm gonna now have to Google his hair and see what's going on. And we're kind of nearing the end here, so of course, did want to always mention that it's more than appreciate you coming on. This was like obviously a huge blast. I don't get a chance to talk too much wrestling these days. You know, obviously 1,000% more than I do, but it is always fun to kind of dive into deeper points of wrestling and kind of just talk about things in general. And I appreciate you taking the time to come on and do that. I know listeners of mine are going to get a great kick out of it. And, you know, perhaps I'm not going to ruin anything, but perhaps there's more to come in terms of wrestling talk with the two of us. I'll leave it at that. So I know you have a couple key social platforms that you're very active on, and I want to make sure that we stress that so everyone listening that can hear how passionate you are about wrestling and goes, you know what, I want to follow what she's doing and what she's talking about. I know I am now because, like I said, your passion. So you can just sense it in your voice when you talk about these people. And I feel like that's so rare these days to find like that pure passion. And, so for listeners out there, what are key platforms for you and how can they like follow your work and how could they get a hold of you if they have thoughts or questions they want to ask you about wrestling?
Absolutely. And thank you so much for the kind words. I truly appreciate it. You're a great host to bring out the best out of your guests. And I'm glad I can bring you back within the wrestling fold. And you did tease some things happening in the near future. We're not going to say what that is yet, but when we know, you'll know, and hopefully we can do that very soon. But as for the people out there, you wonderful listeners, you can find me on Twitter at Lady of Wrestling X. There you can find me tweeting about these podcast shows that drop on the daily, talking about all things Monday Night Raw, Friday Night SmackDown, AEW Dynamite, and NXT. You can follow my podcast, Wrestlesoaptopia, on all podcast platforms imaginable, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, everywhere. You can't miss it. Download, subscribe, you know what to do. I truly appreciate it. And I will get more active on Instagram eventually. I'm not going to divulge that yet, but as soon as I get that thing up and running, I will update accordingly. But once again, thank you for having me to express my passion for all things wrestling. And I hope I didn't bore anyone to tears. That's not my intention, but it's always great to hop on a platform, have some fun. And trust me, when we do meet again, this isn't going to be as, this is lovely. We're going to talk some real shit.
Oh, yeah. No, it's going to get some good nitty gritty. And eventually I'd love to have you back on again. And we're going to put the explicit content on for some future episodes as well. But of course, everyone, I appreciate you taking the time to listen to the Fandom Effect. As always, you guys know there will, of course, be new episodes every Friday. Very new teasing. There's going to be some growth with the Fandom Effect coming in the month of July. So you guys have some cool stuff to look forward to in terms of that regard. Of course, you can always follow me on the Facebook, Twitter at Fandom Effect. And Fandom Effect Podcast is available on almost all major platforms, Apple, Google, iHeart. The only thing not on is Pandora, and I'm working on that right now, but you guys can always keep following. But I, of course, encourage you. The links will be posted when this episode airs for you guys. So you have direct links. You can follow everything on Wrestlesoaptopia, and I highly encourage you to do that. Make sure you subscribe, leave a review. And if you guys enjoyed the work, make sure you give it that 5 stars. It really does make a huge difference. And I know you guys out there are awesome, and you're going to go ahead and show everyone some love. As always, keep exploring new fandoms, everybody. Enjoy it. That's what this all is about. I'm going to keep coming back to you guys every week to give you guys back to the community that's given me so much throughout my life. So very happy to be with you guys this week, and I will see you on the very next iteration of the Fandom Effect. Have a good day, everybody.
Well, not bad for one playthrough. You have multiple achievements left to unlock. Please follow the Fandom Effect podcast on all available platforms and unlock the next level. If that doesn't work, just turn it on and off.